people imagine estrangement as something loud, doors slamming, custody battles, final arguments that divide a family cleanly into before and after. What happened with my father was quieter than that. Richard Cole simply became more available to other people over time. After the divorce, there were still weekend visits for a while, then work trips started interfering. Then birthdays became dinners moved to next week, then eventually our conversation sounded like two polite men waiting for elevators together. Not hostile, just thin. By the time I turned 38, I had learned how to speak about him without actually saying anything meaningful. He lives upstate now. He remarried years ago. We're not very close. Most people accepted those sentences without asking follow-up questions. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing contract revisions at work. A woman introduced herself as Elaine Cole. For a second I didn't recognize the name, even though she'd been married to my father for almost 20 years. "There's been a cardiac event," she said carefully. "They're moving him into surgery now." I remember thanking her, as if she'd informed me about weather. The hospital waiting room looked exactly how these situations always look: bad coffee, dim televisions, exhausted relatives pretending not to monitor every passing doctor. Elaine stood when I walked in. She was elegant in the controlled way some people become during emergencies. "Nathan," she said softly. Behind her sat my half-brother Luke and my sister Avery. Both looked startled seeing me in person, which made sense. I'd only encountered them at 2 funerals and 1 graduation in the past decade. Family photographs covered Elaine's phone case. I wasn't in any of them. Nobody treated me badly. That almost would have been easier. Instead, they treated me like someone adjacent to the situation, included out of politeness, offered coffee, updated carefully. Then conversations drifted naturally back toward histories I wasn't part of. Luke talked about recent fishing trips with Dad. Avery mentioned medication concerns from last year's scare. Elaine answered nurses' questions automatically because she knew his routines. I sat there feeling strangely invisible beside evidence of an entire life my father had continued living without me. At one point Elaine touched my arm gently. "He'll be glad you came." I nodded even though neither of us could possibly know that. Hours later, after surgery, they allowed brief visits. My father looked smaller than I remembered. Machines flattened him somehow, reduced him into measurements and tubes and pale hospital sheets. When he noticed me standing near the doorway, something complicated crossed his face. Not surprise. Recognition mixed with shame, maybe. "Hey, Nate," he said weakly. Nobody had called me that in years. I stepped closer to the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Tired." We both nodded, like that explained everything. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes before a nurse interrupted to adjust medication levels. When I left the room, my father was already turning his attention toward Elaine's voice beside the bed. Back in the waiting room, I seriously considered leaving. Not dramatically. I just couldn't figure out why I was there. Then, around midnight, a cardiologist entered holding a clipboard. "We need to discuss next step authorization if cognitive complications continue," he said. Everyone stood at once. Elaine moved toward him automatically, but the doctor scanned the room and asked, "Which one of you is Nathan Cole?" The room shifted before anyone spoke. I raised my hand slightly. "I'm Nathan." The doctor nodded with visible relief. "Good. We need your signature regarding the treatment escalation directives." Elaine frowned. "I'm his wife." "Yes," the doctor said carefully. But according to the legal documentation on file, Mr. Cole designated Nathan Cole as medical power of attorney under neurological impairment conditions. Nobody moved. I remember hearing the television in the corner, talking about overnight weather patterns while my entire family quietly recalculated itself around me. "There has to be some mistake," Luke said. The doctor shook his head. "The paperwork is current." He handed me a folder. Just like that, nurses began directing questions toward me instead of around me. Medication risks, recovery probabilities, potential complications. Professional attention has weight to it. You can feel a room reorganize when authority becomes procedural instead of emotional. Elaine sat down slowly, not angry. Mostly confused. I understood the feeling. Because I was confused too. My father had spent 20 years forgetting birthdays and postponing phone calls, yet somehow, buried inside legal documents none of us knew existed, he had trusted me with the most serious decision of his life. The contradiction made me feel suddenly exhausted. The doctor explained the risks carefully. Without intervention, recovery odds dropped significantly. With intervention came possible cognitive damage and prolonged rehabilitation. "What would you like to do?" he asked. I stared through the glass toward my father's darkened room. When I was 11, he missed my school concert because of a golf tournament with clients. He mailed me a keyboard afterward with an apology card signed in brushed handwriting. When I graduated college, he left the reception early for a flight. When my mother died, he hugged me in the cemetery parking lot like we were distant coworkers sharing difficult news. And still, somehow, he trusted me here. Not because I was loved best. Maybe because I expected the least. "I want the treatment approved," I said quietly. The doctor nodded once. After everyone else dispersed toward coffee machines and phone calls, Elaine approached me near the hallway windows. "I didn't know," she admitted softly. "I know." She looked embarrassed in a way that made me uncomfortable. "He talked about you more than you probably think." I almost asked why talking had always been easier for him than showing up. But I was too tired for questions that large. Near dawn, I went back into his room alone. My father was awake, staring toward the ceiling. "They explained everything?" he asked. "Yeah." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked directly at me for the first time since I arrived. "You were always the person I trusted to stay calm," he said. It wasn't an apology, but it was probably the most honest thing he'd ever given me. When I finally left the hospital, the sky outside was beginning to pale. Before the automatic doors closed behind me, I looked up instinctively toward the cardiac wing windows. My father stood there in the dim light, one hand resting weakly against the glass, watching me leave like he had finally understood how much distance existed between us and how little time remained to cross it.